Go ahead and get started. Marty will introduce some of our speakers, Stacy Woods. So she'll be online. But just like anybody, I don't have any announcements. Any folks? I know for the potluck, I guess. Well,
Madison, she's
Madison.
sort of,
Oh, that's right,
old
Madison,
and
sorry.
sort of new.
Yeah. You're involved with this project too?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, go ahead and get started. Hand it over to Marty.
Thanks, Doug. So good afternoon, everyone. And so thanks for your time this afternoon. And before I hand over the podium, so to speak, to Stacy, I'd like to just give you a little background on how someone from Washington, D.C. and sitting in D.C. happens to get involved in a project in Kentucky. So a few years back, maybe 4 years, when I was trying to get some of this work going, I came to meet Stacy through the Yale Carbon Containment Lab. And at that time, I had this kind of conceptual idea about using ArcGIS and geospatial analysis to develop a tool to prioritize wells for plugging. And so I had this idea despite the fact that my GIS skills are basically zilch. And so it really wasn't going anywhere until I met up with the folks at the Yale Carbon Containment Lab, who then in turn introduced me to Stacy, who was at the lab at that time. And so we, through a series of fits and starts, kind of got the effort going. And it really got going, though, however, when we got real money to do work, right? And so that happened in 2022 with funding from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law to do methane measurements. And at that time, Stacy had been working with me largely as a nonprofit, right? So we were actually beginning to be able to pay her to work with us. And so what you're going to hear this afternoon is really largely her efforts with support by me, efforts by Darren Zier as well. But let me give you a little background on Stacy. So she's a geostatistician by training, and she basically looks at applying spatial data science to environmental health research, law, and policy problems. And she's worked on a variety of environmental issues. She worked on the lead pipe problems in Flint, Michigan. She's also worked on pesticide runoff in Florida and the impacts on manatees. And she's held positions with the Natural Resources Defense Council, the U.S. EPA, Florida Medical Entomology Laboratory, and the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. And she has a PhD in environmental health engineering and a master's of public health from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, where she was a Brown Scholar in community health. So she has really a very strong and varied background in applying geostatistics and GIS analysis to a variety of environmental problems. And let me say here that kind of the problem we faced in this project is, the state is getting pretty significant chunks of money to do this work. So they got 25 million in the initial phase. We're now in a second phase where they got another 25 million. And it looks like we may be involved in a third phase going out through 2030 with another potentially 30 million involved. And of course, most of that money is going to plug wells. Over the course of those three phases, we anticipate that somewhere probably on the order of 1,500 to 1,700 wells will be plugged. And that's a good thing. The problem is that we have about 14,000 plus wells that we know about, right? So that we're basically getting at right at 10% of the problem. So that's the first challenge. The second challenge is that most of these wells have not had eyes on them in years or decades. So the question then becomes is that given the large number of wells and the fact that we never really see these wells, how does one go about most efficiently using a finite amount of funds and human power to plug wells that will give us the greatest environmental benefit? So that really is the problem in a nutshell. The solution to that problem actually comes through two avenues, right? The first avenue is courtesy of the KGS oil and gas database. So a lot of these wells that are abandoned, we have information on them, so we can look at various attributes of those wells, and we have location data for those wells also. The second part of that solution then is the expertise to analyze that data. And so that's where Stacy stepped in to this breach. And like I said, I think what you'll see her present today is a way for us to look forward rather than backwards and be proactive about how we make decision-making process in plugging wells. So with that, I'll hand it over to Stacy.
Great. Thanks so much. Hi, everyone. As Marty said, I'm Stacy Woods, and I'm a consultant with the Kentucky Geological Survey. I'm really excited to be joining you all today to talk about the hazard assessment that Marty and Darren and I have been working on. We were doing this to help the Kentucky Division of Oil and Gas prioritize abandoned wells for plugging, but also as an idea that other states can use to help them prioritize their wells that need plugging as well. And I can't get my slides to go. 1 second. There they go. All right. So at the time that we started our research, like Marty said, there were over 14,000 abandoned oil and gas wells in Kentucky that had known latitude and longitude. And I know that it won't come as a surprise to folks in this room or virtual room to know that these wells can pose hazards. So for example, they can contaminate soil and water. They can emit methane and other gases that can pollute the air and contribute to climate change. And they can pose public safety hazards, especially when they're located in areas where folks live and work and recreate. So as Marty mentioned, the bipartisan infrastructure law provides funding to find and plug orphaned and abandoned wells. And the Kentucky Division of Oil and Gas, or KDOG, inspects orphaned and abandoned wells to identify wells that pose environmental and public safety hazards for priority plugging. The challenge, of course, is that these well inspections are really time and resource intensive. And so this leads to delays in plugging of hazardous wells. So our proposed solution was to create a hazard assessment that uses historical well data, as well as environmental and public health data to estimate hazards that are posed by these wells. This will allow for strategic prioritization, efficient resource allocation, and just a note that our work here can be used as an additional method in addition to KDOG continuing to do these on the ground well inspections. So how did we start? Well, we started by identifying what the priority hazards might be. And to do this, Marty did a lot of legwork here. There were interviews with well operators in Kentucky. We all reviewed relevant scientific literature. We've all presented at professional organizations in meetings. We've had conversations with colleagues at AGU, AAAS. Marty mentioned the Yale Carbon Containment Lab, and of course, folks in your department, as well as conversations with people at KDOG. After all of this, gathering people's input about what kind of hazards they wanted to see in this hazard schema, we then sat down and said, okay, what is the available data that we have to us? And this is how we came up with our overall hazard schema. We have an overall hazard that's made of 4 different category hazards. The first is atmospheric hazard. To answer that, we ask the question, how likely is a well to emit methane? Now, of course, wells can emit things other than methane, but going back to that idea of what data was available to us, Marty and Darren were collecting methane measurements in the field. So we had that available to us, and that is what we based our atmospheric hazard score on. For decay hazard, we asked how old is the well and how salty is the well brine. For environmental hazards, we asked how close, that is vertical depth, is the well to the potable groundwater? How close, that is on the surface, is the well to the nearest water body? How often does the well area flood? And is the well located in a critical habitat for endangered species? And finally, our 4th category was public safety hazards. How close is the nearest drinking water well to the abandoned oil and gas well? Is the abandoned oil and gas well located in a park, forest, or a wildlife management area? How many people live close by? And is the well located in an area of environmental justice concern? So where did we get all this information? The hazards that I've circled here are based on the locations of the wells. We call those our geospatial hazards, which were assessed using available and relevant spatial data. These geospatial hazard data sources included the latitude and longitude of the wells themselves, and then environmental data like the location of water bodies and parks and critical habitats. We also considered how many people live close by to the abandoned well and whether or not the well is located in an area of environmental justice concern. Those are areas that have more pollution and less resources compared to other areas of the country. Now, for the hazards I have here, the relevant information for these hazards were actually intrinsic to the wells themselves, and that data are collected from state records. The intrinsic hazard variables included well type, date of completion, and well depth. And I'll talk more about all of these hazard variables, but especially these two that I have circled later in the presentation. So of course, whenever you use historical data, you're going to come up against missing data. And almost half of the data was missing for each intrinsic variable, and over 60% of the wells were missing one or more of these data points. So we had to deal with that, or else we weren't going to come up with a hazard scheme that could be applied to more than half of the wells. So we did this by estimating what is known by borrowing information from neighboring wells. So for unknown well depth, we use the average of known well depths from neighboring wells to estimate unknown well depths. We use the average of completion years from neighboring wells to estimate unknown completion years. We use the most common of known well types from neighboring wells to estimate unknown well types, and the most common subtypes of known wells to estimate unknown well subtypes. But then, of course, the question becomes, how do we define neighbor wells? Well, we started by applying a spatial statistical techniques to define neighbor. So first, we affirmed spatial autocorrelation. That means that wells that were closer together were more similar than wells that are further apart. Once this was confirmed, we then assessed the distance at which that spatial autocorrelation drops off, right? Like how far away do you have to be before you stop being similar to your nearest neighbor? The spatial statistics confirm that we could, statistically speaking, use wells at a greater distance to estimate unknown well values. But this is where it's critical to confirm what the stats are saying with what's happening on the ground. So I brought the stats to Marty and Darren, and they actually suggested a smaller radius to define a neighbor buffer based on their experiences and observations. So with a combination of statistics and ground truthing, we decided to define neighbor well as within 1 mile of each other. So the graph that you're looking at here shows how wells tend to be clustered in Kentucky. We actually found an average of 64 wells within a 1 mile radius buffer. And since, of course, the data is skewed, I also want to note that the median number of wells within a 1 mile radius buffer was 20. This clustering reflects the oil and gas practice of, drilling where you find oil, right? For me, I was excited because having so many close by meant that we could impute a lot of missing values. And indeed, it was incredibly successful. So if you'll recall, before we used any imputations, we were missing one or more critical data point for 60% of our wells. Using the 1 mile buffer, we were able to get that down to only 9% of our wells with missing critical data. So once we have identified the hazards and we gathered all the relevant data, the next big challenge for us was, how in the world should we go about scoring all of these different hazards? So before I go into how our group decided to score these individual hazards, I just want to note that this is just one potential scoring option, right? It's what we came up with, and I'll certainly get a little bit into our thinking. But I'm also, welcoming you all to consider how you might approach these different hazard scores. And I hope that we'll have time here in our discussion to kind of chat about your feedback and ideas. So our considerations for the overall hazard score, we wanted to avoid any implicit scoring. So, if I score a well from 0 to 100, and I say to somebody without giving them any information, this well is a 94 and that well is a 54, that person will think this is an A well and that is an F well, right? So we really wanted to come up with a hazard scoring that had nothing to do with any kind of implicit scoring that viewers might have already. We wanted to weigh all the major categories equally. Folks can, of course, choose to drop categories if they're not interested in them, but we didn't want to make that assumption about which hazards were most important. So we wanted to weigh all the major categories the same. We wanted to work with data structure of the information we had of the subcategories. And finally, we wanted to keep it simple because, like I said, we're hoping that this is useful even outside of Kentucky, as other states are trying to come up with ways that they are going to figure out how to prioritize their own wells for plugging. And so keeping it simple might kind of increase the uptake. So we started by scoring the 4 major categories. We decided on a maximum score of 20. Because the number of subcategory hazards are all a factor of 20. And further, the subcategory data actually lent itself naturally to 5-point scales. So for example, for our continuous variables, we used quintiles to assign hazard scores of 1 through 5. For our binary variables, we assigned a score of 5 if a well met hazard criteria, and a score of 0 if the well didn't meet the hazard criteria. And then for these variables, we actually created specific data-informed hazard scores that I'll explain here. First, for our flooding hazard score, that was based on an area's flooding frequency following USDA's SURGO, that's the Soil Survey Geographic Database flooding frequency description. And as you can see, again, it really lends itself so very well to a 5-point scale, going from very frequent flooding, which we gave a 5, to very rare 1 or practically never, which would be a 0-point hazard. For the age hazard scores, we base those on historical inflection points. And I want to thank Marty for this really helpful timeline. So age hazard scores are highest for wells completed prior to 1920. That was the pre-cementing era. The next era saw some cement development. And then starting in 1940, we had rotary tool and redundant zonal isolation. And then starting in 1960, we see the beginning of state oversight of plugging. That brings us to the modern era, the lowest hazard, which we define as 1975 to today. Brine hazard scores are based on both collected data and published literature. So exposure to brines degrade well bore integrity over time. And while both the age of the wells and the brine salinity impact well decay, this is where Marty's field observations come in. His observations suggested that brine salinity actually plays a larger role in well corrosion than time. So while age is scored from 1 to 5, as we talked about in the previous slide, brine salinity is actually scored on a 15-point scale that you can see here. And finally, our emissions hazard score are based on Marty and Darren's field work. They have 119 emission tests, and those outcomes are shown in this graph, just noting here it's on a log scale. The data shows that, gas wells tend to emit more methane than oil wells, which tend to emit more methane than injection wells, and that is consistent with other research findings. The hazard scores themselves were based on the average emission for each well type, and then we just scaled it to a maximum of 20. But because we were working with very limited data, again, only 119 observations at the time, both our own, that's at 119, but also limited data from other researchers. we decided to apply an uncertainty factor. We added one hazard point to each of the lower value categories, oil and injection. That was just to be conservative and assume that that there's a potential for greater hazards than what we identified with our limited sample size. We will certainly plan to revisit these scores as we gather more information about methane emissions from the different types of wells. So our final hazard scores. The maximum amount of the final hazard score became a maximum of 80, of course, 20 for each of the 4 categories. And you can see here the breakdown. Again, every major category has a max of 20, and the subcategory hazards add up to that 20. So finally, we created descriptions for each hazard score level. And here you can kind of see how those descriptions were applied to the category hazard scores and then to the overall hazard scores. You can see that the majority of wells lie here in the elevated and the high categories. And also that there were a little over 1,300 wells that we had missing critical information. So those remain unknown in terms of their overall hazard score. However, for the overall scores, we actually created a 5th category of most critical to really highlight the 14 wells that had high relative hazards across multiple categories when they're compared to other wells. So why this, hazard scoring breakdown, right? Why is lower 1 through 5 and not say 1 through 7? It's not really about the numbers themselves. It's rather how any given well's hazard score is, compared to other wells. Because in an ideal world, all of the orphaned wells would be plugged, but even then you have to start somewhere. So these overall hazard scores, which are again relative to other wells, provide a suggestion of where to start with your plugging activities. We created a story map as a tool for folks to interact with the data. And I can't use the chat while I am presenting. I don't know if Darren or Marty, if you could drop it in the chat, or we can do that later. But I'll pop over and we can look at the story map in a minute. The story map at the very bottom includes this interactive map with these buttons that allow users to investigate how focusing on different hazard categories changes the relative hazard landscape. It will also soon include a link to download all of our data from the individual hazard variables up to the overall hazard descriptions. So with that, I'm actually going to switch over to the story map, and then we'll pop back over here for a quick wrap up. So can everyone see the story map now?
Yeah.
Great. All right. So because story maps are public, I wanted to provide information for anybody who stumbles on it, and they may not have been in this presentation or the one that we gave K-Dog last week. So we just give a little bit of history and we talk about the hazards that these wells present. I don't know why the pictures are not working. Let me refresh this. Okay. There they are. Okay. So yes, I wanted to show folks the different hazards, and these are photos by Marty and Darren, including this one that stars Darren. And then here, it's a simple location map. It just shows where they are. I wanted an opportunity for folks who are here to investigate any address, so if you just, oh, I didn't spell it right, but it still got to it. So if you want to put in your county, if you want to put in your address, here it allows you to zoom to the area. And then I talked, about the challenge like we talked about here, and I provided our hazards as well as relevant literature. And I talked about the unknowns and the hazard scoring and our emissions findings. And finally, again, getting down to that interactive map here at the bottom. So again, I wanted to make sure that people were able to kind of say, well, what if we're only interested in potential emissions? Like what does that do to the hazard landscape? If, for example, KDOG is really interested in focusing here, you can see that maybe they'd want to start in this area, right? And so same with decay, if you really are more focused on that, environmental hazards and public safety hazards. And also I wanted to show you that on any of these, when you click on the well, you get the relevant information for that well. As long as Esri's playing nice, great. So you can see that this one is an oil well. Here's its permit number. You see its overall hazard level and the scores. And you also see the scores for each of the categories. And like I said, these URLs are being worked on right now. We submitted these to get a URL that should be updated soon. But here, this will be a link to the report that Marty and Darren just published for KDOG, and that gives a summary of some of our work. And then here, this will be a link to our data. So that will bring you over here. I just wanted to go through it really briefly just to show you all. So it has all of our information. And I have these highlighted just to show that I have this sorted by overall hazard level, like most to least, but you can sort it by any of the categories. So for example, you might want to sort it by just the air category. And as an example, I just pulled out the most critical overall, so we can talk about one well. So we'll just take this highlighted well, for example. You see that it's most critical. It has an overall hazard score of 57. And you can look at its category hazards here. It's critical for emissions, elevated for decay, high for environment, and critical for public health. I won't go through all of the subcategories, but you can kind of see where this is coming from. So it's a gas well. So that means it has the highest level of emissions potential. It's located in a hunting area, so it's got that kind of higher recreation hazard that comes into public safety. It's located in an area of environmental justice concern. And I just want to point out that the field definitions are all defined here, so you all will be able to understand what these mean even without me. It is also located in a critical habitat, this one for the Indiana bat. One thing it has going for it is it's in the no flooding frequency, so that's good. We wanted to allow KDOG to be able to sort by counties. So say they're doing work in a county, they can sort and gather all the wells that are in one county. And all the wells will include their unique identifiers as well as latitude and longitude. And with that, I'm going to head back over to a slideshow just to wrap up. Great. So we set out to create a hazard scoring schema that was informed by experts, that followed observations from the field as well as the published literature, that used available data, that avoided any implicit scoring schemas, that worked within our given data structure, that is simple and is also adaptable. And, it's always hard to come up with the first version of something, but I think what we have here is a really good base. But at the same time, we can revisit this scoring schema as we learn more and we get more data. So for example, I mentioned the hazard emissions, the emissions hazard, as we get more field test results from our emissions field tests. And of course, folks can download the data from the website and come up with wholly different approaches to hazard scoring. So that really gets at that adaptable piece there at the end. So with that, I will stop and say thank you all and open this up to any questions and discussion.
Okay, thanks, Stacy. Yeah, happy to entertain questions and comments. As Stacy said, this is kind of a good time for us to hear from you folks and kick the tires and what you think about what we've done so far. And yeah, we're really interested in hearing your comments about our strategies and methods and things we might consider going forward. Portland.
Yeah, really great talk, Stacy.
Can you hear him?
Is this type of work, I guess the question I have is it unique to Kentucky, or is this being pursued else in other states in a similar way, or do you know?
So to my knowledge, and Darren and Marty, please jump in as well. Most of the idea of ranking certainly is very popular. However, a lot of the kind of hazard scoring still relies on that on the ground approach where every well is inspected. And that's certainly important. I think that we should continue to test for, water quality and soil quality and air, emissions around wells. But we wanted to come up with a way that we could also use information that is known without having to go to the wells. And to my knowledge, this is the only one that we've seen that does that. Marty and Darren, do you have anything else?
So to answer your question, Corwin, I think we're really out on the front edge of this. So we attended a meeting in February, the national meeting in Pittsburgh on orphan wells. And there is a group out of NETL that gave a presentation kind of with some of these moving parts, right? But I don't think that they had quite put them together and integrated them like we have so far. And so this idea is around and is being probably thought about. So I guess they're probably at the stage I was 4 years ago when it was a concept in my head, right? So we're kind of out ahead of this. And the other thing that really facilitated this is our database here at KGS. The bottom line is that we have a very granular and information-rich database. And even with that rich database, as Stacy mentioned, when we pull up this data for these wells, we still had, half our data are unknowns. And so, just by fortuitous circumstances, we're able to use some statistics to make inferences about a lot of the unknown wells. But let me just kind of back up for a second to underscore a point. So at the top end of this talk, we talked about 14,000 known orphan wells, right? And the question is where would you go with that and making a decision? And so if you look at Stacy's analysis, hazard analysis, we now have narrowed that 14,000 down to 800 wells that are critical or most critical. So that becomes a much more tractable problem to address as opposed to 14,000. And I guess the other thing I would say is that this is not a standalone tool. It's actually meant to be used in combination with other types of information you might have. Go ahead, Steve.
A question I have from the ranking, and keeping everything solid. Do you have an idea of historically how KDOG approached plugging abandoned wells? The reason I ask that, if from the coal side, AML, if it's within a mile of somebody, it moves to the top no matter what. And I was wondering if KDOG had something like that where essentially you've already got rid of this huge population of something so that you don't have to maybe worry about that.
Yeah. So did you hear that question, Stacy?
Sure. So I think first our database is only the wells that haven't been plugged yet. And we certainly found wells that were in locations with people, with public safety hazards. But Marty, the KDOG website does say that they are interested in plugging wells that have environmental and public safety concerns first. But Marty, do you know the specifics of how they define that?
I'm sorry, say again. I was looking at a chat.
Oh, do you have the specifics of how KDOG defines their highest priority right now before our presentation, before we've been speaking with them?
Sure, and not to be flip in this statement, but if the house is on fire, it's a priority, right? So what I mean by that is that it was largely reactive. So if it was, and this I've seen this happen, there was an orphan well in a bank in Ashland. And, it turned out that, methane is odorless, but the other gases do have an odor. And apparently a bank employee came in one day and thought something smelled bad. And they thought, oh, it's the natural gas that we're bringing in to heat the building. Well, Columbia Gas came in and analyzed it, said it's not our stuff. And it turned out a foundation was built over an orphan well that was leaking gas. And so basically that's just a reaction to a problem that's immediate. let me tell you that a good year historically for the Division of Oil and Gas for plugging wells, a good year would be 30 to 40 wells. So you can imagine that any concerns about getting all the bad actors, that's a very long case at 30 to 40 wells per year. So there's plenty of bad actors out there that still remain. So yeah, I mean, that's the cool thing about this is that we can go from being a reactive posture to being a proactive posture. Hudson.
With the imputing with the autocorrelation has been really successful. Have you thought about doing other like cross correlation or finding other proxy layers like depth of bedrock or formations at depth or surface geology to try to build a proxy for some of the wells you don't have information on based off the autocorrelation?
Yeah, actually, we've talked about that. I think we were trying to balance moving forward with a limited amount of time. And so when we got down, just to 9% of missing data, we just decided to push forward and get feedback on the method. So we haven't gone back and refined, but certainly, yeah, looking for cross correlations and to be able to even drive that down further was certainly something we're interested in doing in the next iteration.
Okay, there was a message in the chat from Alex asking about whether or not we had considered using UAV surveys to look at methane emissions off wells. And certainly that has been used to some degree in other areas. The challenge for us, Alex, is that only our highest emitting wells, say that are putting out over 500 grams per hour, would be wells that we could potentially resolve with the UAV survey. The other challenge with UAV surveys is that, especially in Eastern Kentucky, is the fact that you got to stay above the tree canopy. And unless you're using some laser absorption method, that methane really disperses quite quickly. And so you won't be able to resolve it, say, if you're, say, 60, 70 meters off the deck, flying your drone. And it have to be conditions in which there's really no wind at all. So it would be nice. Yeah, but yeah, so far I don't think that we have a large emitters for that to be effective for us. Any other questions here? Well, if you have comments, like Stacy said, we're going to get this on our website, the story map, along with the supporting data. And if you do end up with questions or comments that will help us make this a better tool and product going forward, we'd certainly love to hear from you. Stacy, thanks so much for jumping in. And appreciate it.
Thanks all for having me. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.